first section?
Fantasy.
Pentateuch.
Very good. All right, what's the first book of the Pentateuch?
Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers.
Deuteronomy.
Very good. All right, that is the first section, which is the Pentateuch. What is the next section? History. Very good. What's the first book of the history section?
Joshua,
Judges,
Ruth, First Samuel,
Second Samuel,
First Kings, First
That's,
Chronicles.
I tell you what, that second one's really easy, isn't it?
First Chronicles,
Second Chronicles.
Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther,
All right, that's the history section. All right, what's the next section? Wisdom. Very good. What's the first book of the wisdom section?
Job.
Job. Very good. What's next?
Psalms,
Psalms.
Proverbs,
I always get these two mixed up, Ecclesiastes,
Very
Book of
good.
Solomon.
Song of Solomon. Very good. All right, what section of the Bible are we in now?
Minor Prophets,
Major prophets.
Major prophets. Very good. All right, what's the first book of the major prophets?
Isaiah,
Isaiah.
Jeremiah,
Lamentation,
What are we doing today?
Ezekiel.
Ezekiel. Very good. Y'all did. That's the best that y'all have done yet. Y'all did very well. See, you're doing good. You're learning. That's exactly what I wanted you to do.
So,
you know it's going.
Y'all are doing good. I appreciate the effort because that at least lets me know that you're trying. So that gives me some encouragement. All right. So the book of Ezekiel. One of the things about Ezekiel, as we'll talk about, is the time frame. The time frame is really important in regards to the context of the book. So that's we really need to understand that, and we'll discuss the time frame. We'll discuss. We'll kind of go back a little bit and just kind of cover that time period again, so that way just so that way we've got a good understanding of when it takes place. And remember, we had talked about that there were the word exilic, which for exile. There were pre-exilic prophets, which we know some of those. Two of those we've already talked about are Isaiah and Jeremiah. And they prophesied before the exile took place. All right, so those are pre-exilic prophets. All right, then there were exilic prophets, which were prophets who preached during the time of exile. Then there were prophets who preached the post-exilic prophets, and so we'll get to some of those as well. As far as the authorship of Ezekiel, not a lot of people, kind of like with Jeremiah, there's not too many people that argue about who wrote it. It seems that there's a good deal of just continuity on this, that people just, scholars tend to agree that Ezekiel wrote the book. Now, Ezekiel was taken captive, and he was actually in the exile, or part of the exile, when the Lord spoke to him, and we'll get to more of that here in a little bit. One of the things about him is that he was a prophet, he was a priest, and as we go through the book, you'll see a lot of words and a lot of different types of summary statements that go back to Levitical type things that you find in the book of Leviticus. You'll find a lot of things about the temple, especially the new temple. So you'll see that since he is a priest, you'll see that kind of that throwback to those things, because those things would have been very important to a priest. One of the things about Ezekiel is that a lot of people think that he passed away while he was in exile, that he never did get released or had the opportunity to go back to Israel. A few things about the book of Ezekiel that we need to pay attention to. One of the things is that you'll see a theme is the glory of the Lord. You'll see that quite a bit. We'll see that here in the first chapter. You'll see a lot of graphic descriptions of the destruction of Israel and Judah, and you'll see that despite God's kindness to them and forgiveness to them, they still had a lot of disobedience, which we've already covered a lot of that anyway in Isaiah and as well as Jeremiah. But this, he shows more of this. One of the things that we'll see again is that this book shows God's desire for Israel to bear fruit. And, you know, I think that is something that I think most pastors or most people who are preaching to another group of people, that's something that they desire as well, is to see some fruit being borne by the people that they're preaching to. But Ezekiel, as you'll learn, is that very early in the book when God calls him to prophesy, is that just like with Jeremiah and Isaiah, he's told that he's going to be prophesying to a hard-headed and stubborn people. Now you would think that these people that he was preaching to, they had been told for almost 200 years that somebody was going to come, Babylon was going to come and destroy them if they didn't straighten up. So they were still hard-headed after the fact, even after all these prophecies came true. And, this was, a lot of these people who were taken captive, who were taken back to Babylon, they heard Jeremiah's prophecies about the downfall and the exile of their people from Babylon. You would think that they would say, oh my gosh, Jeremiah was right. Well, I guess everything else that Jeremiah said was right. We better straighten up. Well, they didn't. Sound like people today, don't it? People ain't changed. People are people. They've always been like that. We've always had, all of us have had a streak of stubbornness, haven't we? Nancy says, no.
Yeah.
Never.
And I'll probably have a whole lot more.
Yes, we have those times, don't we?
It's more Terry's.
But within this book, it shows, even though they were hard-headed, God shows them, the wrath that he's going to carry out, the destruction, and the consequences for doing these things. And there's a lot of symbolism that you'll find in the book of Ezekiel about a lot of different things. One of the major theological themes that we'll see throughout this is that we'll see God's holiness and his sovereignty. And so his holiness is that, his stance on sin, his stance on being obedient to what he says, to the law, listening to his prophets, looking forward to the future Messiah and paying attention to that. And then his sovereignty is showing through that even through his judgment and his wrath, he is still with them, and they are still his people. And that is a sign of his sovereignty, is that even though these calamities took place, Babylon, Assyria came down and destroyed the northern kingdom of Israel back in the 700 BC, and then Babylon came down and destroyed Jerusalem and Judah in 586 BC. During all those times, God said, that happened because I allowed it, I directed it, and I'm still here directing it, and so that's what I want you to know. And he said, I haven't given up on you, but I had to discipline you. And so that shows God's sovereignty. And even today, we need to know that as well. As we see terrible things going on, and sometimes we get caught up in that. You know, I believe that in our country today, our country has turned away from God. There's a lot of churches who aren't churches anymore. They don't even preach the Word of God. They talk about stuff, but it's not very godly. And it's kind of like what Timothy talks about, is having this form of godliness but denying the power of it. That's what we see a lot today, and I believe that we're getting some of God's wrath and judgment, even though there's a lot of people who may be following His will and way and doing the best they can. You know, we're going to get caught up in some of that stuff, but that's where we need to understand God's sovereignty, that if we are in with this, that we need to make sure that we're trusting God, having faith in Him, but also reaching out our hand and teaching and saying, hey, we need to get back on track. We need to restore listening to what God says. We need to restore reading and studying and applying His Word today. And making sure people understand that God is still in control.
Show fruit.
And so those are things that we need to know. But those are things, His holiness and His sovereignty is a theological theme throughout this book. Another thing that we will see is later in the book we'll see this future kingdom. And we'll get some good glimpses of things that are going to take place in the future. We got some of that with Jeremiah, but not to the extent that we're going to have it in Ezekiel. Jeremiah talked about this future kingdom in a way that was kind of vague. It was kind of a broad stroke of what the kingdom would be like. But Ezekiel is given a better glimpse of that vision for this. Isaiah, he talked about it some as well, about different things, about how the millennium would be. And so Ezekiel, he shares some light. So each prophet is a little different about what God showed them and what they shared and wrote down about how this millennial kingdom will take place and kind of what it'll look like. So you just got to kind of keep in mind and just piece together what each one of them say to kind of create the whole. Because that's what we're doing with God's Word anyway. We're taking all of these different writings over all this thousands of years, and we're just putting them all together to try and see one big piece. And it's history, but it's His story. I'm sure you've heard that quite a few times, but it really is. This is God's story. One of the things that you'll see here is that know that I am the Lord. That is used about 60 times or more in this book alone. And I think that phrase is used more here than in any other book of the Bible. So again, that's pointing to God's, He's talking about His sovereignty and the things that He's doing there. So that's important to know, and you will see that quite a bit. Now, part of this is, like I said, about knowing the time frame. Some of this book, in some of the book, Ezekiel is prophesying in between the two exiles. Now, what I mean by the two exiles, now, if you go back to what we were talking about, remember we were watching the movie. Now, Babylon came down 3 different times. That second time that they came down, that was when they took a good portion of the people. Now remember we talked about how Jehoiakim was taken off into exile. He was the king, but King Nebuchadnezzar put in place of Jehoiakim a vassal king who was Mattaniah, but he changed his name to Zedekiah. All right, so Zedekiah was put as a vassal king for Babylon, basically. So he was a puppet king, so to speak. And so during that time, when that transfer of power took place, Babylon took the best and the brightest out of Jerusalem and took them back to Babylon. Now that's when that would have taken place in I think it was 593. 593 BC was when that happened, and they would have taken those people back, and so Ezekiel was taken in that exile. Now remember also Daniel, remember we talked about him, he was taken during that exile, as well as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So there's 5 people that are big characters in the Bible that we know that were taken during that exile. Now Babylon didn't come in and destroy Jerusalem at that time. So that was that first exile, and so the second exile, the big exile, the one where Babylon came in and completely destroyed Jerusalem, that was in 586 BC. So part of this book is Ezekiel preaching during those 2 exiles, during that time. And so you'll see that as we go through some of this book, you'll see Ezekiel prophesying about the coming destruction that Babylon is going to bring Jerusalem. So he's telling the people in exile what's going to happen back home. And so that's got to be a sobering thing for Ezekiel to be doing, and also to be telling these folks. Because some of these folks believed that they weren't going to be there very long. And that this was going to be a short-lived thing, and that they were going to get back home and everything would be hunky-dory. Apparently they weren't listening on the day when Jeremiah told them exactly what was going to happen. And they didn't remember what Isaiah said. And what this reminds me of is people who don't listen when people are talking. People who don't read the Word, people who don't study the Word. God says a lot in His Word, and there's people who go to church every Sunday who don't know anything that this Word says. Same type of instance, same thing. People didn't want to listen. Now something different. Isaiah and Jeremiah both, remember how in Deuteronomy we were talking about, if I said to y'all, said, hey, let's talk about the Mosaic Covenant, and what book would we want to go to if we want to talk about blessings and curses? And you would say, well, that's in Deuteronomy, because a lot of the book is entirely about blessings and curses. And so especially when you get towards the end of the book. All right, and so a lot of what you see when people start talking about the breaking of the Mosaic Covenant, which we saw Isaiah talk about, but we also saw Jeremiah talk about it an awful lot. That was one of the things on his mind, was this breaking of the Mosaic Covenant, which was the breaking of the law. What differs with Ezekiel is Ezekiel talks more about the stuff that we find in the book of Leviticus versus what we find in the book of Deuteronomy. So we see Ezekiel since Ezekiel was a priest, Jeremiah was also a priest, but I guess God didn't give him those words. This Ezekiel, priest, prophet, is going to be preaching more and going back and drawing from the book of Leviticus, the book that nobody ever wants to go to. I guess because it says, it has all these things, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. And so people don't like to hear that. So I guess that's why they skip over it. But it's a very important book. And I would encourage you not to skip over it. Whenever we get to Hebrews, we're going to go to Leviticus a lot. And I would always read those two in tandem, because you'll learn a lot. If you don't understand, when you read through Hebrews and you don't understand a lot of what it's talking about with the symbolism there, go back and read Leviticus in tandem, and you'll start to get it. Makes much more sense. the way that we break down the book of Ezekiel, basically you can break it down into three parts. Verses, or chapters 1 through 24, pretty much talk about the judgment and destruction of Jerusalem with glimpses of hope and restoration, just like we saw in Jeremiah. There was a large portion of the beginning of Jeremiah that dealt strictly with judgment and destruction, but then there were glimpses of hope and restoration. So Ezekiel's on par with that. Chapters 25 through 32, which is the second part of Ezekiel, basically deals with the judgment against the nations. Now, we've already seen that in Isaiah, because remember there was a large section where Isaiah went through all these different nations, and it was judgment upon these nations. Jeremiah, there was a whole section where Jeremiah went through all these nations that was prophesying their destruction. Ezekiel does the same thing. There's a large portion, chapters 25 through 32 talks about destruction of these nations. And then the last part of Ezekiel would be chapters 33 through 48, and this looks into the future of the glorious restoration of Israel, especially about the future temple and the renewed presence of Yahweh among His people. Now, to me, that's exciting when we start talking about God coming and being in our presence again. And, you know, I think just think about this for a minute. Why is God not in our presence now like He was in the Garden of Eden with Adam and Eve? Sin. So you think about that. If God is in our presence again, then there's something drastic must have happened. And so, you know, it's talking about that time. And so just, you know, thinking about those times when, you know, that sin factor isn't there. That's glorious to me. And so that chapters 33 through 48 will look into that. One thing I will say, Ezekiel is a unique book because Ezekiel talks about some things, especially this first chapter, that you don't find elsewhere in the Bible. It's super hard to interpret. It's hard to understand. The stuff that is in chapter 1 and some other parts of Ezekiel, I would keep this in mind. Don't get too caught up in that. Those things they're good to study, and we're going to talk about some of those, but that's not the main focus of this book. So when you're reading Ezekiel, I don't want you to get caught up in that and say, well, that's just that's weird, I don't understand it, so I'm not going to read it. Don't worry about that stuff. Go to what you understand, read that, and just ask the Holy Spirit to help you get through it and understand what you need to. But don't get caught up in the weird parts. There's a lot of stuff in the Bible that we don't understand.
Amen.
And so, you know, the thing that we need to understand is, like with all books of the Bible, when we're studying them, we know that God's in control. We know that He always has been, He always will be, and that's what we need to know. And so if we read it from that kind of perspective, it helps us just kind of get through the book, and you know, it just helps us that way. There's a lot of truth in the book of Ezekiel, things that we can relate to. Focus on those things, and I think you'll be fine. Today, we're not going to get real far in Ezekiel, because the more I looked at it, the more I said, you know, I don't want to skip over it. I want to go through it and just, you know, see what we get. Maybe we can figure out a way to understand it. But today we're just going to go through chapter 1, because it's a weird chapter. And if you put yourself in Ezekiel's position and imagine being shown this stuff, This ain't everyday stuff, folks. This ain't every once in a while stuff. This is a crazy vision. So we're gonna look at that. But first of all, let's look at verses 1 through 3. Because 1 through 3 get us started. 1 through 3 actually it gives us two timelines. And that might throw some people off, but I think if you understand what's happening, then the verses 1 through 3 helps it. Once you get past that and say, okay, well that makes sense, now I can move on. Do you ever get caught up when you start reading Numbers and you just kind of skip over that? Don't skip over that. There's a reason why it's there. Especially here in Ezekiel, there's a big reason why it's here. Bless you. I don't know how many times you sneeze, but bless you that many times. So let's deal with the two timelines. All right, so the first timeline we get is in verse 1. It says, in the 30th year, in the 4th month of the 5th day of the month, as I was among the exiles by the Kibar Canal, the heavens were opened, and I saw visions of God. All right, so that first verse just lays out one timeline. All right, it tells us when it is and where he is and what he saw. All right, so the first thing we got to deal with is, what was the 30th year? What's he talking about? There's a lot of speculation about what that is. There are some commentators who said that they were in it was the 30th year since they had the last Jubilee. Or that, every 7 years they would set people free. Some people say that, but if you look at the timeline, it doesn't really coincide. So it doesn't match up. So that's one, put that one on the shelf and go to the next one. The next one, people seem to think that this 30th year was 30 years from when the law was found under King Josiah. Now, if you do the math there, it gets close, but there's still some discrepancy where it doesn't quite add up. Remember when we were watching the movie of Jeremiah, the opening scenes was when the law was found under King Josiah. Because remember, they were doing some construction on the temple, and they were digging, and they found this scroll, and it was the book of the law. And so that was in the 600s, and so that was in the early 600 BC when Josiah was ruling. And so some people say, well, that's what he's talking about there. Well, as I said, the numbers don't quite add up perfectly. So put that one on the shelf, and let's talk about the next viable answer. For me, I think this one is more in line with Ezekiel's role, his family, his age, and his lineage. All these things come into play with that 30th year. And the reason I say that is he was a priest, but he was in exile. He had no temple to serve in. So what does the 30 mean? Well, turn to Numbers 4. Numbers chapter 4. Numbers chapter 4. Now there are several times that it says this. But let's just look at verses 29 and 30. because it virtually says the same thing, just takes out one of the clans. But verse 29 says, "As for the sons of Merari, you shall list them by their clans and their fathers' houses, from 30 years old up to 50 years old. You shall list them, everyone who can come on duty to do the service of the tent of meeting." Now, in chapter 4, that's listed, that exact phrase, 30 years to 50 years of age to do service in the tent of meeting. Now, who served in the tent of meeting? Was it just random everyday folks? Or was there a particular group that served in the tent of meeting or the tabernacle? Who was that? Priests. It was priests who served in the tabernacle. And so the key word there is 30. From age 30 to 50. So now when we go back to this, look at Ezekiel.
Wait a minute, that's 30. That number 30 is when Jesus started preaching, wasn't it?
It was.
Well, that's what you're trying to get to, right?
I was getting there.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No.
I
No. I'm glad that you caught that. I'm glad that you caught that because, right now, Jesus is our high priest. And, they say that there are no coincidences. And Jesus started his public ministry around the age of 30, which would have been the appropriate age for a priest to start his service
Right.
as a priest.
Right.
See, before then you would have been preparing for that. But see,
Well, I'm sorry.
No.
Stole your thunder.
No. Do not apologize whatsoever. I'm glad you brought that up. No, I'm glad you brought it up. But see here, Ezekiel, that 30th year, many believe that was his birthday, or his birth year, was the 30th year. So that's when he could start serving, but he had no temple. But see, here, this is going to lead us into God gives him service. See, there's a lot of things here. This is where God's holiness, and especially his sovereignty, because God is just not sovereign in Israel and Judah. He's sovereign everywhere.
But every number in the Bible has significant purpose.
Yes, some are a little more obscure than others, but obviously there are certain numbers that do have a lot of meaning. Obviously, number 7. That's the one that's most recognized. That's
Or
the number.
70 too.
It's the number of completeness.
Yes.
So there's a lot of numbers that have to do, and there's people who spend a lot of time breaking those things down. People who like math better than I do. So better than most of us. They broke that stuff down. But in the 30th year, speaking of people who like math, people have figured out exactly what day this is. If we were to put it on our calendar, what day this would be, 30th year, the 4th month of the 5th day of the month would actually be July 31st. So that's that. Because of the timelines, they have been able to pinpoint exactly what day this was. So I think that's a pretty cool little thing to be able to go back and say, this is the exact day that he's talking about, using the Jewish calendar. But like I said, many people believe that 30th year was actually him saying that I'm 30 years old, I'm a priest, and I'm ready to serve. So that's what a lot of people believe there. Now, he tells us something else. He tells about his setting. Says that he was among the exiles. So this tells us that this has taken place, when he's writing this, that this has taken place after 593 BC, when he was taken into exile, along with Daniel, his 3 friends, and many of the other, the best and the brightest. The other thing that it tells us is where he was at when this happened. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that he was with other people. Surprisingly, the Babylonians gave them a lot of freedom to roam around, which seems weird if you're going to take them if you're going to take them from one place and put them in another. You think that maybe they would have them in prison or something, which they did have. They did have prisons because Jehoiakim was there for a while. But a lot of these people were given a lot of freedom to roam around in that land, and apparently Ezekiel was one of those people who was given some of this freedom. So he was among the exiles. That tells us that he was part of that group. But more than likely, he was by himself when he had this grand vision. But it tells us where it was at. It says by the Kebar Canal. In some versions of the Bible, it might be spelled Kebar. Mine's spelled Chebar, Kebar. But just wanted to kind of give you an idea of where that was at. Now, this was a man-made canal. This was not a natural canal, and a lot of people believe that the reason that there was a large portion of Jews here was because to the Jews, whenever they would do the purification rites, what we would call baptism today, whenever they would do this, they had to be near moving water. Because remember, it had to be living water. It couldn't be stagnant, stale water. It had to be living water.
You're right. You're
It
right.
had to be living water.
Yeah.
And so here,
Yeah.
now here, this was considered, like the capital of Babylon. And then you come on down, and this part here, the Euphrates is here, but this canal goes, it's like a tributary that runs here, and it was man-made. Because they had wanted water from the Euphrates to run through here, so they built a canal. And so they believe that right in here was where it's at. And the reason they believe it was right in here is because they've done excavations in this area, and they found a lot of Jewish artifacts. And so we have some fair certainty that this is where it was at, based on the evidence. And so now here's Ur. Now who came from Ur? He's one of the patriarchs. Abraham. Abraham comes from the land of Ur. So this is where Abraham and his family originated from, was down here. So here's the Kebar Canal. That's where Ezekiel is sitting. Maybe he's meditating, pondering, whatever, praying, whatever it might be. And during this time, while he's there, here comes this grand vision. He said, and I saw, he said, and the heavens were open, and I saw visions of God. So now, we don't know if this was something that if there had been other people standing there, if they could see it too, or if this was just something that Ezekiel could only see himself. I would say that this was probably something that only Ezekiel saw. Now that's a closer shot of where this is at, just so you kind of get an idea. But he had these visions, and then when we look at verse 2, we get another timeline. All right, so what does this timeline mean? On the 5th day of the month, it was the 5th year of the exile of King Jehoiakim. All right, so what does that tell us? Well, we know the date that the exile happened, and I misspoke. It was 598, 597 BC when that first exile come down, and it says that this was in the 5th year of King Jehoiakim, because King Jehoiakim was taken in that first exile. So that was 598, 597 BC. So this would have taken place 593 BC. So I apologize for that, so, you know, I make mistakes once in a while. But here, that gives us that timeline of when so they're 5 years, at least at this point, they're 5 years into the exile. In verse 3, it says, the word of the Lord came to Ezekiel the priest. So, all right, so that tells us about, his profession. All right, he's a priest. The other thing, it says that he was the son of Buzi in the land of the Chaldeans. That Chaldeans and Babylonians was something that was used interchangeably by the Shabar Canal, and the hand of the Lord was upon him there. All right, so that just kind of gives us that kind of summary statement about what was going on. So now you know when he was there, why he was there, and what he was doing. So now we get to the heavenly vision. Now the rest of the chapter, we're just going to go through this because it's weird and we don't understand it. So we're going to try and understand some of it. Even if we don't understand it, we're going to try anyway. So what we see, the very first verse, verse 4, says, as I looked, behold, a stormy wind came out of the north, and a great cloud with brightness around it, and fire flashing forth continually, and in the midst of the fire, as it were gleaming metal. Now, let's just take that. All right, it said he saw this coming out of the north. Now, a lot of people think that this was an indication, because remember, the total destruction of Israel, or of Judah and Jerusalem, had not happened yet. So a lot of people think that what he's seeing, these storm clouds with this fire coming out of the north, is another example of a foreshadowing of what Babylon was going to do. Because remember Jeremiah, Isaiah both said that they gave signs about coming from the north. So a lot of people believe that this is the same thing. This is an indication. It's coming from the north, so this is just showing that there's going to be, God is coming, or wrath is coming from the north. And it just kind of tells us that it looks like a big old thunderstorm, big nasty thunderstorm. We've all seen those. We're that time of year where they can come up any time of day. Might be clear as a bell, and then all of a sudden, boom, there's a thunderstorm. In verse 5, now verses 5 through 14, it talks about the living creatures. It says, and from the midst of it came the likeness of 4 living creatures, and this was their appearance. They had a human likeness. All right, so that gives us one description of what he saw. These living creatures had a likeness of humans. All right, so at first glance you would see human characteristics. Verse 6, but each had 4 faces, and each of them had 4 wings. All right, so we got the human likeness part, but now they got 4 faces and 4 wings. Now it's getting weird. So can you imagine seeing a storm, and then in the likeness of that storm, that's interesting. 4 faces on each of them and 4 wings. All right. It's not something you see every day now, is it? Now, I don't know about Ezekiel, but I might have just been a little, I might have puckered a little bit when I saw that. I might have been a little bit more attached to the ground if I was sitting down when I saw it. In verse 7, said their legs were straight, and the soles of their feet were like the sole of a calf's foot. And they sparkled like burnished bronze. All right, so apparently they had a very bright appearance. Obviously, if they were around glory, which they were, then we know that anything that's around glory shines bright. You don't have to look too far. Just go back to when Moses was in the presence of God, and he came down the mountain, and his face was shining. And people were afraid to look upon it because his face, the Hebrew there literally says that his face was beaming with light. So he was visibly brighter after being in the presence of God. And so obviously these creatures, these living creatures, who were in the presence of God always, obviously they're going to be very bright. It talks about the soles of their feet being like the sole of a calf. A lot of people think that the reason this detail was given is because of the way that these creatures, as it's going to talk about in a second, the way that they move, that this would have enabled them to be able to move in that way. Now, I don't know. I'm not going to go too much into that because I don't really have any say-so in that. So we're going to go to the next description. Verse 8. Then it said, under their wings, on their four sides, they had human hands. And the four had their faces and their wings thus. Okay, so we know that they had human hands. Alright, because remember he's already said they had a human likeness. Now we know that they have human hands. So we know that in some way they look similar to us in some regards. Some regards. Verse 9. Their wings touched one another. Each one of them went straight forward without turning as they went. As for the likeness of their faces, each had a human face. Alright, so they had the likeness of a human, I guess in shape and stature. We know that they had human hands, and we know that they also, out of the four faces that they have a human face. Continuing with verse 10, it said, the four had the face of a lion on the right side, the four had the face of an ox on the left side, and the four had the face of an eagle. Okay, so this gives you a better description that a human face, a lion face, an ox face, and an eagle face. Now that's really getting weird. Alright. Most people tend to agree because what's one of the things that we have to do in order to understand the Bible as we're reading it? I talk about it all the time.
We need to pray.
Well, we need to pray for sure. But as we're reading, what do we need to do? What's something that we need to take into consideration as we're reading the Bible? Especially if we don't understand something.
Get the wisdom.
Wisdom. The word I'm looking for is context. You always have to have context. Alright, so you're saying, well, what is the context here? This is weird. Is there anything else weird we can associate it with? Well, no, not directly from the Bible, but we do have a lot of archaeological evidence from other cultures at the same time period. Where were they at? In Babylon. Babylon had a lot of creatures who had human likenesses, but they had different faces. They might even have wings or hooves. So these visions that these other people had in ancient Near Eastern culture, that would have been something that was not surprising to see from somebody who lived during that time period. And so now, we don't know, now remember, he's having a vision. So, one of the things that we're trying to figure out here is, okay, are these real, like physical creatures? Or are they just a part of the vision that Ezekiel is seeing? I don't know if I have a good answer for that or not. I really don't. We know that Isaiah, he had a vision and he saw something similar. But I think, again, like I said earlier, I don't think we need to get too caught up with these details versus the theological stuff, because that stuff has importance with us. So he's seeing this stuff, he's seeing their faces, but the faces do have importance. In that day and age, the context, the reason that these ancient Near Eastern cultures used those faces with other, conglomerations was because they had a certain power, like a lion. A lion was considered the most powerful beast on earth. It's still considered that today. What's known as the king of the jungle? The lion. So that hasn't changed in a long time. This is 2,500 years ago, and it's still the same. So a lion still has that presence of being powerful and majestic, and just being that symbol of power. So Babylon, they used those images a lot, using a lion as a symbol of power. So here you have a human face, and you have a symbol of power. But then also you had the face of an ox. An ox was considered the most useful of all the domesticated animals, the most powerful and useful of all the animals that were in servitude. So an ox was a very useful animal, a very powerful animal. I was watching some videos the other day, and some oxen were attacking cars. And the ones with horns, they were grabbing cars and just flicking their head like that and flipping cars over. So ox are really powerful, especially you think about, pulling and doing all of that stuff. Ox were, they were a symbol of servitude, but they were also, it was powerful, because think about it, if they wanted to, they could really hurt you.
It's just like water buffalo in Asia.
So they could really, really hurt you. But they were a domesticated animal that had in a lot of ways, a divine purpose. Now, ox are still used today in many parts of the world. Now, let's go to the eagle. No matter where you go in this world, an eagle is a sign of statesmanship, power, royalty. And so when you think about all of those things, a lot of scholars tend to think that the representation of all these ancient Near Eastern things come into play too, but also the fact that this is God's way of showing that He is all of that He is all powerful, that He is all loving, He is all serving, He is all being, He is everything. And that's what these four things represent. And so a lot of people attach that to that. So I would tend to agree with them, because that stuff makes sense to me. And it would also make sense during that time period in which it was written. But you got to give Ezekiel a break here, because you imagine trying to describe what this stuff looks like, trying to write it down on paper. It'd be tough, especially if it's something that you've never seen before. So we'll give him a break.
Just like John in Revelation. I mean, he
Yeah, John.
describes stuff.
John saw some of this stuff too.
We don't. It could be,
Now, one of the things I will say about is this, when I ask the question, is this Ezekiel Now I'm giving you some room here. I'm giving you some latitude to think for yourself. I don't have a definite answer on this, but is this something that God's specifically showing Ezekiel as just a vision, or is this something that Ezekiel's seeing that's actually real? Well, when you look at what is seen in the book of Revelation and those different things, then, that's something that I think we have to take into account, because we do have other instances of this. Now, we do have physical, there are physical manifestations of these creatures throughout the Old Testament. Let me read you this, and let me see if you pick up on it. Verse 11 says, "Such were their faces, and their wings were spread out above. Each creature had 2 wings, each of which touched the wing of another, while 2 covered their bodies. And each went straight forward. Wherever the Spirit would go, they went, without turning as they went. As for the likeness of the living creatures, their appearance was like burning coals of fire, like the appearance of torches moving to and fro among the living creatures. And the fire was bright, and out of the fire went forth lightning. And the living creatures darted to and fro like the appearance of a flash of lightning." All right, so one of the things it says that their wings touch each other. Now, this is the second time that they've mentioned that. That wherever they go, whenever their wings are up, they touch each other. Then it tells us about their appearance, where it says, the main thing here is it says, whenever the Spirit goes, they go. So they're completely in tune with the Spirit of God. So wherever the Spirit moves, they move. It tells us that they go to and fro just like lightning, as quick as lightning. You ever seen a flash of lightning? It goes by pretty fast, don't it? So that's what they look like, going bouncing across. That's what it looked like. Now, we get into some even more weird stuff. The wheels. Wheels on the bus go round and round. This ain't a bus. Verse 15 says, "Now I looked at the living creatures. I saw a wheel on the earth beside the living creatures, one for each of the 4 of them. As for the appearance of the wheels and their construction, their appearance was like the gleaming of beryl. And the 4 had the same likeness, their appearance and construction being, as it were, a wheel within a wheel." Now, you can imagine what a wheel within a wheel looks like. You can imagine that it was imagine a round wheel with maybe spokes and another wheel inside. That's not unusual. We've seen those, especially like on wagons and chariots. Now, a chariot would make sense here. A 4-wheel chariot. Now, where it gets, kind of weird is talking about how it moves. Now, it says that they don't turn. They don't have conventional turning. But it says that they have this wheel within a wheel, so people tend to think that maybe this wheel is maybe like it's got the round part, but it's got another one that's perpendicular. And so they're like this. Have you ever seen a wheel like this where it's round? It's more like a globe. Well, it doesn't. It can do this without turning, but it can go in any direction you want it to go without actually turning the wheel. So it is a different type of wheel. Some people believe that that's what it's talking about because realistically, that's the only way that it can move without turning with a conventional wheel. So to me, okay, that kind of makes sense. That's not that weird. What gets weird is the next part. Verse 17, "When they went in any of the 4 directions without turning as they went. And the rims were tall and awesome, and the rims of all 4 were full of eyes all around." All right, that's where it gets weird. Now, a lot of people, they spent an inordinate amount of time on trying to decipher what this means. I don't know if this is real eyes or if it's something else. Somebody has suggested, and I would tend to think that maybe this is, I don't know, maybe this is right. But they said that there's in that time, that there was a jewel that looked like that was shaped like an eye, that they would embed on furniture. And it was a very bright jewel. And so if you can imagine these bright jewels encrusted around these wheels where it looked like they were encased in eyes. I don't know. That's a suggestion that somebody made. Okay, maybe it makes sense, but hey, it is God. They got 4 wings and 4 faces, so they could be covered in eyes too. And so if that's the case, if it's covered in eyes, then, if you want to go that route, then there's the interpretation that because this thing moves with the Spirit, it's all in conjunction, and it all moves as one moving piece, is that these are the all-seeing eyes of God. To me, that makes sense. So in either way, whether it's jewels encrusted on wheels or whether it's all the eyes of God, I can believe both of them. So this is where I'm not going to tell you one way or another. I'm just going to give you what I know, and you can pray about it, you can read it and discern for yourself. But again, let's not get too caught up on this. We're just going to talk about it and explain it, but the most important stuff is what he talks about as far as restoration and future and all that stuff. So, but it's in here, so we got to talk about it. So he got all these wheels and got all these eyes on them, or diamonds, whatever they are. It said, verse 19, and when the living creatures went, the wheels went beside them, and when the living creatures rose from the earth, the wheels rose. Wherever the Spirit wanted to go, they went, and the wheels rose along with them, for the Spirit of the living creatures was in the wheels. When those went, these went. And when those stood, these stood. And when those rose from the earth, the wheels rose along with them, for the Spirit of the living creatures was in the wheels. So he's kind of redundant there, but I think he's trying to get the point across that they all work in conjunction. Whenever one moves, they all move. Whenever it stands, they all stand. Everywhere they go, it's all one fluid movement. There's nothing that's lagging. They all go wherever the other goes. And it's all tied with the Spirit. Now, verse 22, this gives us another vision of what's going on here. It says, over the heads of the living creatures there was the likeness of an expanse, shining like awe-inspiring crystal spread out above their heads. Now that's something that representation was also seen back in the Old Testament, back in the books of Moses. There was an expanse scene like that. But then also when you go to the book of Revelation, there's also an expanse like that. Remember the thing that looks like the glass, that looks like crystal, and you've got all these people looking up? Perhaps maybe that's what Ezekiel is seeing. But he sees this shining, and he says it's awe-inspiring. Have you ever been somewhere and something just, this was that plus 1,000,000 times. In verse 23 it says, under the expanse their wings were stretched out straight, one toward another, and each creature had 2 wings covering its body. And when they went, I heard the sound of their wings like the sound of many waters. That's one description, like the sound of many waters. Like the sound of the Almighty. There's a second description. A sound of tumult like the sound of an army. So he gives 3 different descriptions on what their wings sounded like when they moved. They sounded like rushing waters, like the Almighty, and like an army. Try and put those 3 together. I don't think he could truly describe what they sounded like. So he just put three things there, maybe to just show. Have you ever heard the power of like flood stage water? I mean, it sounds rough, right? And then also the sound of an army. Now, I've heard the sound of an army on TV. I've never actually heard the sound of one in real life. You know, some of you guys have. But, you know, a marching army, or, you know, a large group of people all marching in unison or all in a group can be a loud noise. And so I can get that. But these are all ways that he described what it sounded like. It says, when they stood still, they let down their wings. And there came a voice from above the expanse over their heads. When they stood still, they let down their wings. All right, so each time, now every time it talks about these things, it talks about their wings being stretched out, when it's moving, being stretched out, and they're touching. They're always touching each other. Can you think of any creature in the Old Testament or any representation in the Old Testament where this might have been? Where somebody fashioned these things and they were somewhere? I know it sounds kind of vague, but I'm trying to get you to think. All right, y'all keep thinking on it. I'll come back to it. I want you to keep thinking on it. All right, verse 26. And above the expanse over their heads there was the likeness of a throne, in appearance like sapphire, and seated above the likeness of a throne was a likeness with a human appearance. Now in the Old Testament, anytime there was any kind of divine, godlike figure that was of human appearance, this was always called a theophany. This was called a pre-incarnate Christ, the physical form of God. Now, remember Gideon? He saw a pre-incarnate Christ. Say who else? Remember in Daniel, walking around in the fiery furnace, said he saw one like the likeness of the Son of Man. All right, that was a theophany. There was also another one when Abraham met the three angels.
Meshach.
Well, one of those, the one that turned around and was talking, the other two went on. They believed that also was a theophany. That was the pre-incarnate Christ that Abraham was talking to. So there are all these. There are a lot of descriptions in the Old Testament where there was a likeness of the pre-incarnate Christ that these people saw. So they see this appearance. Said he had a human appearance, and upward from what it had the appearance of his waist, I saw as it were gleaming metal, like the appearance of fire enclosed all around. Have you ever seen where metal is so hot that it's white?
Yeah.
And it's you can't look at it because it's almost too bright to look at.
Yeah. Just like welded.
So that's what he's talking about here. He said that's what is up from his waist up. It was just so bright he could not even look at it, and it was like there was fire all around it. He said, and downward from what had the appearance of his waist, I saw as it were the appearance of fire, and there was brightness around him. And so his entire essence was almost, he couldn't look at it. He couldn't see anything because it was too bright to actually see it. But he could tell that there was something there. But then in verse 28 it says, like the appearance of the bow, the rainbow, that is in the cloud on the day of rain, so is the appearance of the brightness all around. So think about whenever you see, a bright colored rainbow on the backdrop of a very dark cloud. And that rainbow just stands out, and you can see color like you've never seen color before. Now we can see color on paper, we can see color on TV, but it just doesn't match the color spectrum of a rainbow against a black cloud. There's nothing, I've never seen nothing as vibrant and colorful as God's rainbow, God's color. And so he's describing that that's how bright it was and how colorful it was. It wasn't just a bright light, but it was a myriad of all of these different colors that he was seeing. And he said, "Such was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. And when I saw it, I fell on my face, and I heard the voice of one speaking." So he finally realized what he was looking at. He finally realized that, oh, this is the glory of the Lord. I better get on my face. And he heard the voice of one speaking. Alright, so he's realized that this is Yahweh, and immediately he falls down and starts worshiping. Now maybe he was seeking Yahweh and didn't expect to see it this way. You know, he got all these visions, all this other stuff, and then all of a sudden, there's God. And we know it wasn't an angel, because, you know, like we've seen in Revelation, the angel says, "Stand up. I'm like you. You don't have to worship me." That didn't happen here. Now, he did tell him to stand up in the next chapter, but he didn't tell him that you don't have to worship me. I think that was already apparent. All right, so I asked you to think about where was these visible representations at of these creatures. Did you think of where they might be at? All right, so let's go back. Let's go back to the book of Exodus. And I don't have a specific chapter. You don't have to turn there. If you want to turn there and look for it, it's fine. After God talks with Moses, he comes back down the mountain, and he gets a description, a detailed description on how to build this place where he's going to come and dwell, the tabernacle. Because that's what they were going to use as a house of worship as they traveled. Now, within that tabernacle, there was something very important inside the Holy of Holies. What was in the Holy of Holies? What was in the most holy place in the tabernacle?
The ark.
The ark. The Ark of the Covenant. What was on the lid?
The Ken Rock. You call it?
These creatures.
With their wings out like that.
Yeah. Remember, their wings are out like this, and guess what? They touch each other. Now, when they built that, why did they build it that way? Other than God said, build it that way. Well, if you notice, whose presence were they in? God's. So when they built that, the Ark of the Covenant, they built it to the exact specifications, just like God said to. And he built the lid, which was a separate item from the bottom. He told him to build it completely different, and to put the cherubim on top with they're called cherubim later in Ezekiel. They're not called them here, but he does name them later. But their wings are touching. It was because the presence of the Lord, when the presence of the Lord came down to the tabernacle, that's where it dwelt, was in the between the cherubim. Now, go past that time frame, go to Solomon. Solomon builds the temple. And God comes and resides in the Holy of Holies. Where does he reside at? where the cherubim are. If you look at the cherubim in Solomon's temple, if I'm not mistaken, I think he built them bigger. They sit on the entire inside of it, and there were two giant cherubim who were touching wings on the inside of the Holy of Holies. Not just where the ark was at, but also that too. But there was something else there. The curtain. The curtain that was in between the holy place and the most holy place. Because what did the curtain do? The curtain protected from seeing the presence of God. What was on the curtains? What did God tell them to stitch on the curtains? Cherubim. So you think of how God used the cherubim. Think of where anytime there was cherubim, he was always in that. They were always in the presence of God. Anytime there was God and cherubim, they were always together. I think Ezekiel here gives us a wonderful image of when God moving and who's with God, and you know, these. It seems to me that these wings of the cherubim are helping protect this vision of God, or protecting Ezekiel from completely seeing God. And you notice they never look up, because they're always, this is above them, they're always below it, so they're never looking up. But their wings are always up. And the only time their wings are down is when they stop moving and they come down. I just think it's interesting, you know, with these cherubim and God's presence, His glory always being there. You know, it's that Shekinah glory. That's the visible glory of God, is what came down in the tabernacle and in the temple. Was that visible Shekinah glory. That's what Ezekiel was seeing here, and that's these cherubim. They're in the midst of that, just like they are in the visible representation here on earth, and the way that they built these things. I just think that's really cool how all that stuff just ties together. And you don't really think about it until you do put it together, and it's like, oh, that's neat. No coincidences. God has a plan and a purpose for any and everything, and I think that shows it. But that's all we're going to get through today. I just wanted to go through that chapter, share a little bit about it, some different thoughts from some different scholars. Maybe you can draw your own conclusions. Maybe you saw something they didn't see, or you got something out of it they didn't see. But it was very interesting, and I think in chapter 10, I think that Ezekiel comes back to those. So now I know that there's a little bit of difference with the cherubim, because in Isaiah there was a description of seraphim. Because remember when Isaiah had his vision, he saw these fire-like figures, but they had 6 wings, and they had eyes all over them. But they're called seraphim, and these creatures are called cherubim. So the Hebrew's 2 different words, 2 different things. So there's two different strange living creatures that God created. We'll get on to some other stuff next week. Y'all got any questions? Any comments?
When I was reading all of this, I mean, it was obvious to me right at first it was God before I read that last verse. But I think we tend to put God on a man level. And if anybody reads this, all of a sudden they realize how much more God is than man.
Exactly.
It's just
Yeah,
mind-blowing, really.
that is.
So that's kind of what I was getting at.
And that's a great point. That is a great point. You know, we do think that a lot of times. You know,
that's why we can't understand why he doesn't answer our prayers in the way that we would,
Right. Yeah,
because we think of it in human terms.
right, yeah. I think that's a good point.
Everybody needs to read this one first.
Yeah.
Or this first chapter.
Yeah, I mean,
to really
and I think a
kind
lot of people, they read this first chapter and then they skip the rest of the book because, I mean, it is different. It is very weird. It's not what we're used to. But, you know, I think of it as like, you know, you think about, well, how did God create everything in 6 days? He said he spoke it into existence, and there it was. So, I mean, if he can do that, then, you know, these creatures are really not that strange, I guess.
Well, think about it too. I mean, Ezekiel was going to be a prophet. He was going to be telling people what was going to happen. You know, and what better way to get his attention?
Exactly. Yeah, that's another good point.
So,
Yeah.
okay, you know, wake up.
Yeah.
Here, know my voice now. You've seen
Yeah.
me in this form. So now listen to my voice and what I tell you that you need to tell others.
Right. And if you notice, going with that same thing of getting, you know, maybe God showed this to Ezekiel to get his attention because God was going to use him as a priest and prophet. To get his attention, also look at Isaiah. Isaiah was also given a vision, and Isaiah realized, oh my gosh, I'm in the presence of God, and I have an unclean mouth. And remember he touched his lips and said, you know, touched it with a burning coal and said, now your lips are clean, go and speak for me. But then also look at Jeremiah. How was Jeremiah called? Jeremiah was called in a vision. And he, you know, touched his mouth and said, you know, now your lips are clean. So far, the three major prophets that we talked about, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, they've all had visions of God to get their attention. I think that's a good point. I think that's a good catalyst to get them moving in their prophetic ministry.
I think it'd wake me up.
I believe so. Yeah, it would definitely get you attention, that's for sure.
Well, he does strange things anyway sometimes to
He
get our
really
attention
does.
for something that's going to happen later on. At that time, we don't know why it's happening that way, but then later on we say, oh, that was God at work. We can recognize it then.
Yeah, well, you know, if you look at how, you know, the Roman Empire came in and took over, and they built all these roads across the land. I mean, you know, they had one vision of why they were building these roads. God had another vision for them. Said, I'm going to use these roads that you're building. I'm going to use these roads to spread the gospel. Ha ha.
Yeah.
Well, that was mostly the downfall of the Roman Empire, that they was too spread out, wasn't it?
Well, it wasn't that they were too spread out, is that they were taxing people too much to fund all the stuff that they had on their budget, and they ran out of money. And so they started going downhill because they was running out of money.
That's kind of sounds familiar.
It does sound familiar, don't it?
Yeah.
Sounds sort of like the United States.
It certainly does, don't it? It certainly does. So, you know, that's it's one of the things about, you know, learning from the past. You know, our forefathers who founded this country, they took a lot of time and studied those things, and they understood what would cause the collapse of a nation. And you know, if we don't, you know, pay heed to their wise words, and they were wise, you know, we're going to repeat the same mistakes.
You know, what was it? It was Kennedy that said history repeats itself.
I think it was somebody before that. I think he may have quoted who that was, but I have seen that quote accredited to somebody before Kennedy's time. Yeah.
This is a Senator Kennedy from Louisiana, when he's talking about.
Oh, yeah.
Oh,
Yeah, it was.
no, I'm talking about.
Yeah, I think, I'm trying to think who it was I saw that it was accredited to, but it was somebody before Kennedy.
Well, that was so true. I mean,
But irregardless of who quoted it first, it's still true.
yeah, yeah.
It's still absolutely true. Those who don't learn from the past are doomed to repeat it.
But you know, when the United States is so dumb, I mean, they'll put a,
Well,
they'll put a.
It's not the United
They'll put a
States.
country entire, just like Afghanistan, Iraq over there, and pulling out.
Well,
And I said, to start with, it's gonna be another Vietnam right there. Another Vietnam. And
What?
that's what it's turning out, that's what it,
well, it's not America that's dumb, it's the people who are in charge that's dumb.
yeah, same thing, yeah.
But I guess if you use the Reagan trickle-down thing, instead of using it for economics, you use it for brilliance, then I guess this would be the trickle up. Dumb people vote for dumb politicians, and those dumb people
I remember
have
Bush,
dumb ideas.
Bush Jr. saying this, when he sent troops in there, he said, this isn't gonna be another Vietnam. I remember distinctly him saying that.
Well,
And now it is.
It's going to be now, but they're taking
And all that equipment and everything,
leaving.
well, the lives that's lost over there, which was nothing like, it was less than 3,000. But, you know, the ones that's maimed and lost legs and whatever. But it's nothing, the body count was nothing like Vietnam, 58,000.
well, I've got some opinions on that, but we're gonna close it out today and go ahead and close with a word of prayer. Barbara, you want to close us with a word of prayer today?